Coast of Caroline get that bite. I just want to say a minute about NOAA. You know, he talks here at communications about climate change. It's hard to have a conversation if the person you're talking to doesn't want to talk about climate. It's hard to have a conversation if they can't even say the word climate. And literally, 3 or 4 years ago, that was the situation in Tallahassee. All of us that were eager for partnerships and support in Tallahassee just didn't find any response. There was no one was resonating. And along came Noah, and he changed the conversation, and all of a sudden we were talking about sea level rise and climate change. We owe a great debt to our Secretary of Department of Environmental Protection. You've got a great panel coming up, so I just want to give you a couple of highlights on some of the things that are happening at our regional level, the Compact, Southeast Florida Regional Compact, at the county, and some exciting news that you'll hear more about next week, but I'll key up something for your attention. So you may have heard it yesterday. I wasn't here, but I know you had great panels, but as part of the work of the Regional Compact, really one of our signature products is the, every 5 years we update the regional sea level rise projection. And that is more important than anything I think the Compact does. We'll be in update 3.0. It'll be led by scientists from our universities, from our federal partners, our state partners. Science leads that effort. But when we get that projection, it becomes the guide for spending money. We go from science and discussion to action, and it changes the way we make investments at the Water and Sewer Department. I know Hardeep will talk more about that. So that's a very important process. It'll be transparent to all of you. We want your input. I know Dr. Obisekera, who was speaking yesterday, and Dr. Troxler from FIU, they're key players along with many others. That defines the regional effort in Southeast Florida. That's what makes us different than almost any place in the world. So get involved, be critical with those tough questions, but honor the fact that we're doing this in a way that actually changes the way government acts. And I'm very proud of the fact that that's one of many things the Compact does. Secondly, the county has a full-scale effort going on sea level rise discussion and a new recommendation. My staff was here yesterday. Some of the boards are still out there. I'm not going to attempt to talk through all the different options, just to invite you to go on the website, contact us. If you have meetings you want us to come to, this work and outreach will develop a sea level rise strategy, which we will share with the community this fall. Also this year, in about a month, the unique partnership that the county has with the cities of Miami and Miami Beach as part of the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities program. We have been working diligently with input from many of you to create a resilience strategy. Now, under this program, resilience is more than climate. It's a broader scope of issues that I think if you've been involved with this, you know that. But it's about shocks and stresses that affect our community in the future and how we organize, not just in government, but with the civic society, with not-for-profit, with business, with the Greater Miami Chamber. It's very comprehensive, and I think the strategy, which we will share on May 30th, has 56 action items. That term action item is picked in purpose. So we want you to be involved with the implementation of that strategy as we go forward in the next 5 years. It includes climate, but it includes other tough stresses, affordable housing, traffic congestion. Maybe the one that plagues this region, our county, more than anything is the great disparity in income between our populations. So please focus on that. I'm going to close with a really important set of events that's just happened in the last month. The Rockefeller Foundation has been a huge supporter of the 100 Resilient Cities program, but they've made a decision that they're going to change the way they do that implementation. They're not going to back out, but they're going to reemphasize certain things. And I won't get into all the inside baseball of what they're going to do. Welcome questions after the panel. But here's the really wonderful opportunity that is going to present itself for us in Miami-Dade County. Part of the Rockefeller initiative will be to fund a new center on resilience. The name of the center is the Adrian Arst Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. Now, if we were in Denver, where the students were from, they would say, who in the heck is Adrian Arst? How many of you ever know who Adrian Arst is? She's from Miami. She is dedicated to taking the new era of resilience and reinforcing it. You'll hear the term community partner in the next 72 hours. We're going to be the first community partner in the resilience program. So I'm very excited. There isn't a lot of detail. Frankly, the announcement is officially on Monday, a large award ceremony in Washington. Mayor Jimenez is going up to be with Ms. Arst when she's honored. This is not just something about naming a center. These are significant resources that I'm sure will be reported in our media. I'm not going to throw out any more details or I'll get in trouble. The word embargoed is used here. But it is exciting. It only works if all of you stay involved, if you stay involved by those tough questions that you gave Noah, that you give us, and that we don't miss this opportunity to use these new partners at the state level and now in Washington, D.C., where this center will be. So I'm excited. I'm going to use that word urgency a lot more. I think we should take that away from Noah's speech. I don't know how many years we've got, but it starts every day when we get up and we try to think of something we could do. Thanks so much. I appreciate being with you today.
Thank you, Jim. You need to turn it on. All right. Urgency is a word that we used a lot yesterday, Jim. In fact, our keynote speaker, Dr. Michael Mann, started his keynote with two big words, urgency and agency. So with further ado, I think I'm going to have the pleasure to introduce our resilience panel moderator, and also very proud to also say that she's our CLIO board member, Ms. Irela Bague.
Thank you. And I don't like standing behind podiums because clearly, you probably can't see me. But thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. It was nice seeing you yesterday at the Everglades Restoration Task Force. Another very important initiative that Florida is engaged in and hoping to move some of our projects forward. When I was asked to moderate this panel, is Florida future ready, which to me sounds as Florida resilient ready. To answer that question, I started thinking, well, some parts of Florida are probably on their way, but statewide, we have a lot of work to do. Hopefully, our panel discussion with these very esteemed experts, and all of them I can call my friends, will help us provide some ideas, some insights, and some solutions that are already engaged in that probably other parts of our state can start incorporating into their communities. So I would love to call you up. We're going to sit over there. And we have Carlos Castillo, the Associate Administrator for Resilience for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. We have Hardeep Anand, who's the Deputy Director of Miami-Dade Water and Sewer, and also heading up a very important capital improvements program for the county. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we have Michael Antinelli, who is the co-founder of Brizaga, and he's vice president, co-founder of Brizaga. And it is a startup firm that is focused exclusively on mitigation and adaptation solutions for private and public clients. All right, gentlemen, here we go. So I'm going to start with asking each of you to give a brief overview of the kind of work you're engaged in, and we're going to keep it optimistic, right? Because you all know me. I don't do doom and gloom. I don't subscribe to that club. But I respect those that do. Thank you for the urgency. So, Carlos, let's start with you, and we'll go down the line.
Sure. Am I? Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. It's truly a pleasure to be here. I'm the Associate Administrator for Resilience at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is based in D.C., but I'm a South Florida native, so it's any opportunity to come back and talk to you here and to visit family, obviously. When Irela called and asked if I'd be willing to participate in this, I said yes right away. I think I've seen the benefits, especially on mitigation, which I want to tee up a few topics on what we're doing to help with resilience, not the least of which is a reorganization in FEMA that the part that I oversee along with the Deputy Administrator is resilience. And that's basically all of the areas that have responsibility for what we do before disasters. And there's key points in there. My background is I was with Miami-Dade County for 26 years. I was a Director of Emergency Management from 2003 to 2006. So the busiest hurricane seasons on record for South Florida, I was the guy there. So when in 2007 I moved up to DC for the first time and became in charge of recovery there. And I'll tell you, the whole time I was gone, there were no hurricanes here. So clearly, I was the one responsible. And now I'm back. But I've always been proud to say when I was up there, Hurricane Andrew was that, I'll use the term, no pun intended, watershed event for South Florida. It's not the first hurricane we've had, and I was born and raised here, so I remember as a very young kid some of the ones we had in the early 60s, but it had been a long time. The community had changed, our risks and hazard had changed, but we've learned a lot from that, and that's where that urgency comes from. At FEMA, we have a very succinct, concise strategic plan, 3 overarching goals. One is to create a culture of preparedness, and that's one of the things I'm responsible for. 2 is prepare the nation for catastrophic disasters, and 3 is to improve or to reduce the complexity of FEMA and accessing FEMA programs. We've also made a change in what we call community lifelines, and it's how we organize for response and recovery, but also how we organize for going forward and making sure that we prevent and mitigate some of the hazards we have. I mentioned FEMA and FEMA resilience. We're responsible for what takes place before a disaster. So that involves taking proactive steps before something happens. Between 2008 and 2018, FEMA spent more than $65 billion in disaster response and recovery. One of our priorities at FEMA is to invest in mitigation. You may have heard there was a National Institute of Building Sciences report. First one was in 2005 that showed for every federal dollar invested in mitigation, there was a $4 savings in post-disaster cost. The good news is that's been updated recently, and now it's 6 to 1. In other words, for every $1 invested in a federal dollar invested in mitigation results in a $6 savings. It makes economic sense, along with some of the things that aren't taken into account, and we can't forget, is the impact on human life, right? This was strictly for infrastructure and what we do, but just imagine the impact in human life that we take into account with mitigation. There's something, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about it, but part of the commitment to mitigation is just in October of this past year, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act was signed into law. It includes more than 50 provisions. A lot of that is direction for FEMA, and it basically changes the way we deal with disasters. The big part for us is what we're terming BRIC, and that'll be announced shortly, another somewhat embargoed announcement, but BRIC stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. And that involves what we're doing to redesign, and it's truly a game changer, is the funding available to communities, the state and local areas to take on mitigation projects, mitigation programs, like I know we've taken advantage of here. Right now, there's something called pre-disaster mitigation that exists, but it's really unpredictable how much money would be available every year. Now there'll be a set amount, and it's based on at least 6% of the money spent through the disaster relief fund. Before, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars available to the country to compete for, to have programs that'll work towards mitigation, and I mentioned the importance of that. I think I'll stop here. Again, I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to questions coming up, and thank you for the invitation.
Thanks. Hardeep, Miami-Dade County is, we can't talk about, Florida in general without talking about water and how important water is to us. And we're lucky to have one of the largest utilities in the Southeast United States working on a very bold capital improvements plan, building resilience, and really targeting our aging infrastructure. And this is a systemic problem, not just here in Florida, but all over the country. So the fact that Miami-Dade County and our residents are paying to improve and invest in resilient infrastructure is very important so that we can stay here longer. So talk to us, Hardeep, about some of the work you're doing, the capital improvements program, and primarily, wearing my chamber hat, how that program has actually been an economic development asset to our community. So,
thank you, Irela. I can't stop first really thanking the Clio Institute, and a real shout out to Caroline. My first meeting with Caroline was when I was the Public Works Director of the City of Fort Lauderdale. And she really worked with us in getting the entire staff of the City of Fort Lauderdale trained on climate events. And I think that was, and the compact was very instrumental. I remember several key individuals from the compact and the Clio. And that is where I started my journey, frankly. And 8-9 years later, the sense of urgency, the sense of integrating resilience, climate change, sea level rise, not really being the only drivers in terms of resilience. But Jim talked about the need for the shocks and stresses and the 100RC. The Secretary spoke about weaving and integrating resilience in every aspect of infrastructure, the built infrastructure. So with that said, I think just to invigorate the group here, does anyone have a guess of how much water in gallons does exist on planet Earth? In gallons? Millions? Trillions? Hundreds of trillions? So 326 million trillions gallons, I don't even know how many zeros that is, trust me, on Earth, right? But yet we take water for granted. And my job, I have a great job of operationalizing resilience. That's the way I look at it. When I say operationalize resilience, I actually get the privilege of building stuff, but also to integrate resilience into what we are building. And when we talk about integrating resilience, Irela talked about it. It is climate change, sea level rise, storm surge, it's cybersecurity, it's aging infrastructure, it's the threat of emerging contaminants. We talked about lead and copper, everyone knows about it. We are talking about PFASs and PFOAs today, and several other things that will happen and come down the road from pharmaceuticals and everything else that we talk about in our drinking water systems, right? So Miami-Dade County is in the midst of a very large-scale capital improvement program, somewhere in the vicinity of $8-9 billion. And part of it is towards addressing our aging infrastructure at our treatment plants, water and wastewater. And if I'd like every one of you to take away something or at least become advocates, Caroline talked about greatness and bite more than you can chew. I think there's the one thing that we need to talk about in the water sector is to start looking at infrastructure and the need for a sense of urgency in operationalizing resilience at our water, wastewater, stormwater plants. because everything depends on it. Quality of life, tourism, businesses, infrastructure, transportation, health, firefighting. And I'd like to say that we are the first responders to the first responders. With all due respect to all the first responders, if there's no fire, there's no water, there's no firefighting, right? So about 1.6 to 1.8 billion dollars being spent on aging infrastructure. We've got something called the ocean outfall legislation, where we have to reduce the nutrient loadings to our water bodies. We have to reduce the use of outfalls by about 95% by 2025. And we've got some mandates to be met in terms of reuse. Coupled with that, we've got several millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on system-wide improvements at our network of pump stations. You know, we have a very flat topography, so we have 1,000-odd stations. And each of these stations convey wastewater to the treatment plants. So when we talk about resilience, we've got to make sure that the assets and the risk-based systems in managing our assets are also dealt with. So I'll be happy to talk a little bit more in terms of specifics, but I'll probably leave it at that for now.
Thank you. So, Mike, talk to me about your coastal engineer working with a PhD, Dr. Alec Bogdanoff. You guys are business partners, and you were motivated to start Brizaga. Talk to me about the motivation and the work you're doing now, because you've been working with the private sector and also local governments on some of these solutions to, flooding primarily and helping them become resilient for the future.
So, first, I'd like to say thank you to the Clio Institute for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with all of you about this topic. Brizaga was founded a couple of years ago after I had spent some time working in the private sector, both in Miami and in New York City, addressing all sorts of coastal and environmental issues. And what I noticed during that time was that almost every project that really considered the environment and sea level rise and climate change in any great depth were all government projects. Every private sector client that we worked with at that time was focused on maximizing their investment by minimizing their expenditure. And we realized after working in that field for so long that there was going to be an economic benefit in the future for planning for the future. If you're able to build adaptability and resilience into your plans, that will yield returns later on down the road, especially for large infrastructure investments, as Hardeep just mentioned with the operational program at the Water and Sewer Department. So we started focusing on bridging that resilience gap. We wanted to work with private sector developers, private sector homeowners, anybody and everybody on a small scale that was affected by these kinds of issues, because the resources seem limited. It's very difficult and expensive to make any kinds of major adaptations. So we started focusing on exactly how we can leverage the public sector dollars and some of the work that's going on around government to try to harmonize that with what the private sector needs, what individuals need. And a big part of that is really just locally addressing the issues that we can deal with right now. We're at our core, we're an engineering company that focuses on sea level rise and storm surge resilience. It's very hard to separate that from the overall climate problem that we have, but that's a much bigger issue than we can solve by ourselves. So we elected to focus on some of the immediate problems that we know that we can deal with right now today, that buy us more time to be able to handle some of the larger issues that we really need to deal with. A big part of that is being able to communicate. Infrastructure in general has been sort of developed behind closed doors historically, because these are things that are underground that you don't see, that you don't think about on a daily basis. But now as flooding becomes more prevalent, as water demands become greater, the community becomes a lot smarter, or they start paying more attention, I guess. But these are things that people need to be able to understand in order to make effective decisions, and we want to make sure that people have the right tools to understand all of the science and all of the considerations that go into making these decisions, because they are tough decisions and there's trade-offs every step of the way. And the only way to really get a large buy-in from the public is for them to understand that process and be able to relate to it.
Well, thanks, Mike. I'm going to go back to Carlos to talk about, and you know, it's funny how people get educated. Everybody knows what storm surge is now, right? After a couple of hurricanes. And you know where your flood zones are and your evacuation zones are, right? Of course. Now, after, we've been through a couple of years of some very destructive hurricanes in the state, we're learning now that we really need to start investing and mitigating and really building differently. So you piqued my interest because whenever the federal government comes with money, I'm always, very excited. So talk to us about some of these mitigation grants that you're offering, local communities. And frankly, there are so many cities, even in Dade County, we have about 35 cities in Dade County, some of them with large budgets and some of them with very finite budgets. So I think these grants would probably help a lot of our coastal cities move forward.
Well, thank you. And the grants, I believe, will absolutely help us. I help here. I still refer to it as us because it's my home. But the truth is, the first time I met Irela was years ago. We were celebrating the opening of, there were forward pumps that, you remember, this was when I was at the Office of Emergency Management, it was basically a three-agency approach. It was the South Florida Water Management District, the Army Corps of Engineers, and Miami-Dade County through the Office of Emergency Management.
Right. Back when we were cutting ribbons.
Exactly, and this was a primarily government program that came in on time and under budget, so go figure. The truth is, it did a lot to reduce the flooding that we were experiencing in several parts of Miami-Dade County. And it's almost like if I-95 if they're ever finished on construction, you won't think about it because traffic just flows and you don't even think about it. So it's sort of transparent. That's the way it is. We had rain events after that didn't result in the flooding that we got, and that's what we'd like to see, is what we don't see. So Miami-Dade has been good at South Florida in general has been good at going after these programs that are there. The money is there for just exactly what we're doing. So we have a pre-disaster mitigation grant program now, and this will be in place until what I mentioned, BRIC, will be implemented, which we're looking at 2020, so the end of next year, where money will be able to get out on the street. Right now, we're designing that program, so it's based on risk. It takes into account a lot of what we've learned over the years, and most importantly, I mentioned earlier, it's not just based on a yearly appropriation that can fluctuate. So it gives you something to plan for. It gives us something to plan for, to know that there's more money available, because every year we had more applications than we had funding available. And that's a good thing. I think there's a lot of awareness out there. The awareness that exists here on the urgency of these things doesn't exist everywhere. And unfortunately, the challenge for us, not just in mitigation, but in disaster preparedness, is to get the areas that haven't yet been affected, but will be affected, to take it seriously. When you've been affected, for us, I mentioned it was Hurricane Andrew, or for those of you and the students I know weren't here, probably weren't alive during Hurricane Andrew, or hadn't been born yet, even if it was the 04 and 05 seasons, we saw what the destruction that could come. We see it in Maria, in Puerto Rico, Irma, Michael, that's there. But let's not wait until that happens again. And in case you forget what Andrew caused or what the 04 and 05 seasons caused, look at other areas that are affected and take the action now. And I think that's what we're doing to help promote that. We take mitigation very seriously. And 2 points, Jim, when he was talking about some of the stressors that we have, housing, traffic here, and income disparity. Those are three of the many things that are just exacerbated and brought to life brought to the forefront when we're affected by a disaster. So there's already a housing shortage here, right? So now you take out housing for whatever number of people, thousands of families out on the street overnight. Now what? What does that do to the equation? Income disparity. It's one of our priorities to help with financial preparedness. And it's not just for big disasters. There was a study by the Department of Labor that showed 44% of the US population doesn't have the cash on hand to deal with an unexpected $400 emergency. And that emergency could be your car breaking down, it could be a disaster, or anything else. So there's it's a big issue in financial preparedness in the country, and we're doing some things to work on that too.
Well, the fact that we down here are pretty, educated, and because we've experienced so much, and we've actually put our education to practice is very important. But sharing that with others is, as you mentioned, is very important. So Hardeep, you founded the Resilient Utility Coalition, which I found very, visionary in your part, because it's really getting all the water utilities in the state of Florida and beyond to really share best practices. So what we're doing down here can probably be incorporated in other areas and in other utilities that don't have the funding or the budgets to really learn, or incorporate some of these trainings and learning experiences. Talk about that and some of the goals that you expect to push out through the RUC, which we like to call it the RUC.
Thank you, Irela. And again, when I came on board with Miami-Dade County as the deputy to oversee a very large capital improvement program, I had a learning curve. There's no way I would have been able to do it alone, right? I was exposed to a lot of information, a lot of good things. But when you have a sense of urgency and there's a need to accelerate decisions and envelope your decisions way ahead of the issues that you're being confronted with, right? I mean, where there was a need is, we know we have a set of issues. How are we going to really accelerate and put ourselves way ahead of the issues? Because we really did not have the luxury of a sabbatical. We really didn't have the luxury of planning as you go. So inspired by the compact, where the compact did a great job on policies and goals, objectives, stirred the conversations, brought science to the forefront, there was a gap. And that gap was one where we needed to have broad-based partnerships. I'll steal the word from the secretary here. How do you build those broad-based partnerships, and how do you get a unified goal for the future? And we started looking at the stakeholders, and I thought, the stakeholders were our industry experts, our consulting partners, and the analogy I gave them, I still remember my first conversation at the ASCE luncheon, was if you don't know where you're going, where we are going as an industry or as a county, you're not able to bring the best of the best solutions from around the world. Our consulting partners have access to a lot of information around the world. So we do not want to reinvent the wheel. We want to learn from the best. We went out and saw what the folks in the Dutch were doing. And, and others, of course. Singapore has is a great example. So we said, let's bring our industry partners together. Then we started talking about academia. There's so much research that happens in academia. How do you operationalize research? How do you incorporate that into research and development when you know that you're going to be building, let's say, a new plant? Are there better ways of doing business, better ways of treatment and process and technology? Because I will tell you something, money had to be at the forefront, and the word financial resilience came to the forefront, even though there are grants. Sustainable money being sustainable over time became an issue because affordability becomes another issue. So we had to find innovative ways of doing business, and we said, academia plays a huge role in this business. And we needed to make sure that we start accelerating these conversations, so we start building greater, bigger, better, younger water professionals for the future. And how do we start building, bridging that gap? And then, of course, the utilities were important. Funding is limited in the government sector, as we all know. We didn't have access to a lot of training. And it's not training in the top 2% or 5% of the organization. It's training across the entire organization. horizontally and vertically. Because when you get exposed to some of the cutting edge technologies and information, you shouldn't be hearing about it at the first time when the job is being procured. You should be exposed to it. And therefore, there needs to be a sustainable educational conversation so that it's beyond a seminar, it's beyond a conference. Once we leave this conference, how are we going to have these conversations? And then the last stakeholder, which is, I guess, the single most important stakeholder, was the community. At the end of the day, everything we're doing is for community resilience. So we had to bring our community partners, our non-governmental organizations, and several other partners to the forefront. And that is how the Resilient Utility Coalition ended up getting founded about 2.5 years ago. And we've made great progress. We've started doing talks, and we've hosted the summit. We continue to find ways to put ourselves out there so that we can spread the word, but we can also spread the knowledge that we have gained over time, so that then we can kind of plant that information somewhere else, and someone else doesn't have to kind of reinvent the whole process. Is it the best? Maybe not. But as we learn, and that's what adaptation is all about, right? You learn, you look back, you bounce forward, and you continue to tweak and adapt as you move forward. So that's how the RUC came about, and we continue to look for bigger, better partnerships in the future.
Thank you. That's great. And I'm glad that I'm a partner
Yes,
of the Resilient Utility Coalition. Mike, I get this question a lot at the chamber. So what are developers doing? Are they actually acknowledging the fact that, they should be building differently, and what should they be incorporating into their designs so that their buildings are resilient and can, to your point, and we're investing, you pay now or you pay later, so you're better off paying now. Do you have actually developers coming to you now asking for some solutions? And if so, you don't have to name names, but give me an example of like a project somewhere or some of the interesting concepts that have come about with that work.
Yeah, there are definitely developers out there that recognize this as a major issue. A lot of them are very local developers that they want to leave a legacy here. They recognize that when a building goes up, they don't just walk away from it after all the units are sold. That building is going to be there. People are going to remember the architect who designed it. People are going to remember the person who built it. And they want to leave a positive, lasting impact on their community. So we've been approached by several different developers to examine specifically how their building or how their new development may be resilient. There are some guidelines out there already. There are policies that the City of Miami Beach and City of Miami, City of Fort Lauderdale have all implemented in terms of how to design for stormwater management systems or how to elevate to provide adequate freeboard. But people are getting savvier now, and they want to look at things on a more localized basis and understand what their specific risk is, rather than just looking at a flood zone, for example, and saying, this is what FEMA told me my flood insurance is going to be based on. Well, what's the likelihood that this is actually going to happen as time goes on? What's the likelihood that that's going to be exceeded, and how is that going to relate back to my cost now? And what's the return on that? At the same time, they're trying to build to be able to integrate with the community around them. They don't want to stick out like a sore thumb. And a big part of that is understanding what is going on in the neighborhood around them, figuring out what the community is going to do in the coming decades, and whether or not they can address certain things right now, or whether they should put that in their back pocket, figure out how to adapt their building or their development in the future when that does happen, to minimize the cost at that point and maximize the public benefit. There are some developers that are already interested in maximizing the public benefit as much as possible. We've actually had a case where somebody is, naturally they want an exception to zoning, but at the same time, they're also prepared to invest a substantial sum in the local community's flood resilience around them. There are public seawalls and private seawalls that need to be repaired. They're ready to make that investment, and that's going to provide a benefit to the entire community that is within that watershed.
And that takes me to the National Flood Insurance Program, because by incorporating some of these solutions in these communities, it does help their community rating and keep that flood insurance premium to lower than if you don't invest. So real quick, because we're going to run out of time, flood insurance program. We know that Congress continues to extend the deadline, so nobody really wants to deal with reform, but we should. So do you have any idea of, is the federal government really talking about perhaps a whole complete new redo of that program?
In a word, yes. So there is a lot of I think there's bipartisan support for rethinking the National Flood Insurance Program. It has to be. It started in the 1970s. It was a totally subsidized program because people weren't buying flood insurance. We've learned a lot since then. There's not been a major revision to the program since then. So right now, it's set to, the authorization is set to expire at the end of next month in May, but what we're pushing for is an extension until September of the next year so that it can be done right, with, like I said, with bipartisan support, getting input from everyone as much as we can so that it's done using the technology that we have, their risk-based rates. There's a question as to right now, the only areas that are required to have flood insurance are if you have a federally backed mortgage and you live in a flood zone. So if I ask who here lives in an area where it rains, everybody's hands will go up, right? Well, if it rains where you live, it can flood, right? It's not just the areas identified, and it's not just if you have a federally backed mortgage. So, the more that it's realistic in terms of risk-based rates and coverage throughout, it'll help keep the rates down for one, and again, be more realistic. So if you live in an area that's highly prone to flooding, you shouldn't be paying the same as somebody who doesn't. So in a nutshell, yes.
So yes, sometime, at some point, we can expect some reform. Yes. Maybe next year, maybe the year after. Anyway, we stay optimistic and hopeful. So I'm gonna just finish with one last, point and question. Miami-Dade County, I'm very proud that we have one of the strongest building codes probably in the country, and we have put that to test, particularly with Irma. But we've seen that other parts of the state, unfortunately, did not incorporate some of our lessons learned. And I'm talking about Hurricane Michael and the devastation in the Panhandle that is still ongoing, unfortunately. Do you all think that it's fine time to have a statewide building code that addresses wind resilience, flood resilience, and climate?
I'll take a crack at this. The answer is yes, of course, right? Because several years ago, when we were talking about climate change and sea level rise and resilience, sustainability was the word. Resilience was still a word in the infancy stages. And fast forward, resilience has taken center stage. But I would caution that resilience still needs some definition, right? Because it could mean different things to different people. And there's a shock and stressor definition. There's a definition in terms of rebounding, restoring services in the aftermath of a disruptor, and so on and so forth. So I think the things that Irela is mentioning kind of exist in several ways, forms, and fashion. They need to be integrated so that there is a little sense of confusion, the chaos that exists out there, let's say in the developer community or the business community or in the regulatory community, somewhat integrated. And I'll tell you where this is going, because Jim talked about the 100 RC. We've got a great partnership as part of the City Water Resilience Framework. And they're looking at it exactly in terms of water, in terms of one water. How can you look at water in terms of a catchment? Where are jurisdictions, boundaries? Do we regulate water through jurisdictional boundaries, or do we look at water from a single lens? Because there's really no water, wastewater, stormwater, groundwater, surface water. If you really follow water through the life cycle, it's water. And I think, therefore, it'll make it very easy for the developer community and the business community to be able to understand how to put out solutions out there, because at the end of the day, it's also the cost of doing business. And when you have an integrated approach to all of these conversations in a code, in a guidance, in a manual, or some sort of a framework, then it makes sense to all of us. And I think and that would be the starting point.
I'd say real quickly, our role, FEMA's role in building codes is one of advocacy. We want to encourage them. A lot of it has to be done at the local level, local and state level, because each state is different. Each county, each city has its own unique situation. So we encourage that. We support it. Financially, we're supporting it in Puerto Rico now, where we help them hire and train 80 building code officials to help with that there. So we advocate for it. We strongly advocate for it. And I know that South Florida has a tough building code, and it wasn't easy to get there, but it's been worth it, I think.
Yeah, and I think even beyond that, there's the design community has been taking a real lead on this issue. The American Society of Civil Engineers and the Florida Engineering Society, those are two advocacy arms that can really push for change at the state level to incorporate some of those things into the building codes. The American Institute of Architects is another. At the state level, they're very highly focused on the resilience and sustainability issues as well, because at the end of the day, it's a reflection on their work product too. There's a lot of discussions going on about standards of care and what we're charged with as professionals when we know a situation like this is bound to happen at some point in time. At what point is the designer liable when something goes wrong, especially when we know that something can be prevented by implementing a higher level of care. So that's just one area where, as we continue to move forward with this, that will help push those statewide code improvements.
Well, I think visuals are very important and tell a story. And how many of you do remember that house that was the only house standing in Mexico Beach? That's what I mean. So, Mr. Secretary, I know that's not part of your wheelhouse, but take that up there. And it wasn't easy, like you said, to do it here in Miami-Dade County, but everybody was around the table. We had developers, we had builders, we had associations, we had, every entity or organization and community member at that table working on that solution. And I'm very proud because, we are the model, and we're doing so much more. I'm going to open it up to some questions. I think we have time for that.
We do. And I'm going to please just remind you to make it a question, not a statement. Just for the sake of time, we're only going to take 3 questions. So I'm going to start right here.
Sure. Steve Mahoney, representing Sierra Club Miami Group. And I have one particular question, really. I'm concerned about the Virginia Cree water treatment plant and its preparedness for hurricane and so forth. And I'll leave it at.
Great.
Thank you. As we were talking, we are incorporating resilience into every aspect of the infrastructure projects improvements we're doing. We've got several millions of dollars. I can bounce off a slew of infrastructure projects. You might have heard in the news that we were recently awarded a grant by the EPA on VIFIA. And all of the information that we have available today from the Climate Change Compact, we are hardening our existing assets. But I will tell you, what we're doing is we are taking a risk-based approach to asset management. Because you really cannot have certain assets hardened and certain assets not hardened. There needs to be a harmony between assets. So when it comes to new infrastructure, built infrastructure, we are elevating that infrastructure as dictated by existing codes and the climate change projections. When it comes to existing assets, we're either hardening it or we are accelerating the projects based on a risk-based approach to asset management.
Great. We have another question here.
Good morning. My name is Jeff Benavides. I'm from Orlando, Florida, from Central Florida Regional Climate Compact. And this question is really for Carlos's comment that you mentioned earlier. how do we engage communities that aren't seeing that or aren't on that front line, especially with our large region? We have different issues that you all have down here, but I'm curious how some best practices for that.
Well, timing's everything. You know, one is these discussions and even plans in place. You know, I sometimes look at disasters as an opportunity to if you had a chance to rebuild South Florida, or parts of South Florida, but you know it's already built, right? If you had a chance to do it over, this sometimes a major disaster, aside from the serious parts, allows you that in part that opportunity. So we've seen, for instance, areas that are affected by flooding, we've seen an uptick in shoulder communities, or in other words, areas that haven't been affected by serious flooding, an uptick in insurance policies, that they go out and buy insurance, and we're deducing that they see that could happen to them because it's a similar community. So in part is getting the message out. If people identify with that community, so a lot of times you see flooding someplace else, other parts of the country, oh, that's there, you know, you perhaps don't think of it. But, you know, if you can identify with it, you know, 04 and 05, there were the two hurricanes that crisscrossed, not at the same time, but they crisscrossed in Central Florida. You know, bringing that up, I think, in getting the word out is important in getting people to see the benefits of it and the importance of it.
Thank you.
Okay. Hey, thank you guys for being here. I have a quick two-prong question for you guys. One of my first questions would be, what is the county doing currently to teach citizens about the safety of tap water so that we can reduce the purchase of plastic bottles? And then, Mr. Anand, you mentioned very briefly PFASs. And I was wondering, since it's currently, according to the CDC, it's affecting over 10 million people who are drinking high levels of PFASs without even knowing it, what is being done nationally to inform people about the dangers associated with PFASs?
Thank you. Yeah, it's perfluoroalkyl substances. You know, came way back from the manufacturing industry. It's an emerging contaminant, and there could be others down the road, right? And this is where the conversation happens in terms of A, education, B, research and development, and C, bringing technology to the forefront before a problem arises, right? Because when your data starts showing, and again, Irela talked about telling a story. We gather a lot of data in the water sector, a ton of data. The question is, how are we taking that data and packaging the data to tell the right story without really becoming an alarmist? Because that really doesn't serve the purpose, right? And then there is this concept, I think, to the previous question about incremental adaptation. Because you know, we've got systems in place today. We really just cannot shut our systems down and start going, you know, in the opposite direction. We've got to find ways. Resilience is important, climate change is important, but we have some time. So how do we take that time and accelerate it? Going back to your question about what the county is doing, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of outreach that is happening, there's a lot of research that is happening. A lot of consulting partners have pooled their resources together. EPA has some efforts going on in place. Thankfully, in this part of the region, we are not really subject to those challenges or those issues. We don't have a major cause for concern. But I think we've always got to be on the forefront in looking at any of these contaminant parameters that probably are not regulated today, and how are we going to bring those conversations to the forefront so that we can bring some regulatory standards. And then once there is a standard, then there is enforcement. Nothing really happens in a voluntary fashion, right? Because there's a cost, again, to doing business. So I think it becomes that cyclic process where you're able to bring these conversations to the forefront and then start, you know, informing the regulatory process so that then we can align ourselves in incorporating these elements into our capital improvement projects.
Hardeep, and you forgot to mention that we just won an award for the best drinking water in the region.
Yes, thank you.
So on that note,
it is. We did.
Thank you all for joining me.
After many years, you know, it's more of a fun event, but it's always nice. I think it builds morale in staff because, you know, it's very important for the hard work the men and women do behind a fence, you know, tucked away. I think someone on the panel mentioned about, you know, these are all hidden assets. We really don't get to see it. You know, and in the context of climate change and sea level rise, the work that is being done by some of our staff, we've got one of the best saltwater monitoring intrusion systems in the world. And you know, we are always progressively ahead of it. To your question, we are always constantly monitoring our potable well systems, you know, our well field protection systems. We've got great ordinances. Our Board of County Commissioners have...
And I'm going to cut you off.
Okay, thank you.
Because I'm being told we went over time. But if you want to learn more,
Yeah, please
go on
see
the
me.
website. It's a great website. They've got a lot of educational materials at FEMA, at Miami-Dade Water and Sewer, and even Brizaga. They have a sea level rise ready program that's very cool. With that, please, on behalf of Clio Institute, I'd like to thank our panel and
you so
join
much.
me in thanking them.
Thank you.